Thank you for joining us. My name is Raleigh Sadler, and I'm the Executive Director and founder of Let My People Go. And our goal is to empower the local church to fight human trafficking, this mega issue, by loving those who are most vulnerable to it. Because we believe when you target the people that traffickers are when you target the people that traffickers are targeting, you're going to fight human trafficking at a multitude of levels. You are going to, simply by loving that vulnerable person in front of you, whether they be a new immigrant, whether they be a kid trapped in a foster care system, whether they be someone who's homeless on your block, by loving that person intentionally, you're doing the work of awareness, prevention, intervention, and aftercare all at once. And so today, we're going to further explore this idea of how we can fight human trafficking by loving those who are most vulnerable. And joining me today is Dr. Jamie Aten. Dr. Aten is the founder and executive director of the Humanitarian Disaster Institute of Wheaton College in Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Aten.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our time together.
See, what makes me really excited about this time is that we're going to explore how human trafficking and disasters can intersect. And for us to really understand disasters, we have to understand that it's more than one type of disaster, right, Dr. Aten?
Yeah, when we talk about disasters, oftentimes I think people have an image of simply just a natural disaster, such as an earthquake or a hurricane or maybe a tornado. But in fact, there's actually quite a wide spectrum of different types of disasters that not only are there natural disasters, but there's also technical disasters. So that might be things like an oil spill, or it could be an explosion that happens. There's also human-caused disasters, such as terrorism that occurs. Mass shootings would be another example. And then really anything that kind of disrupts civil society, some researchers would consider that a disaster. And then on top of that, there's even public health disasters, where we might see an outbreak of a pandemic, for example.
Wow. So I know a little about your story as we're friends, but I think everyone who's watching, they really need to hear how you got involved in this disaster relief movement. Like, how did you get involved in the first place?
Well, it wasn't anything I set out to do intentionally. In fact, I had taken my very first teaching job at University of Southern Mississippi. And the reason why I went there was that I really wanted to work with minority churches in the Mississippi Delta region around rural health disparities. But I moved in to the South Mississippi there, and then just 6 days later, Hurricane Katrina strikes and hits our own community and goes right over the interstate near where we lived.
And so as that happened, as Katrina is happening, and as you're seeing all this devastation, what were you going through personally?
Well, it was one of those things. We were trying to decide if we were going to stay and ride out the storm, or if we should evacuate. And in fact, we didn't even know the storm was headed towards us. That when I left work on Friday, the storm was supposed to hit somewhere on the other side of Louisiana. And then over the weekend, it turned and was coming up right between Louisiana and Mississippi and threatening our community. But we actually didn't have a cell phone. Our cell phones didn't have a signal. The cable person's supposed to come on Monday. We lived out in the country and didn't have a signal. So we were really clueless that the storm was even coming until we went to church that Sunday. And then the pastor gets up and starts talking about how the storm was threatening our community. And so we, at the time, had one daughter and decided we didn't want her first memory to be this storm, because it was kind of interesting that everybody that we were asking in church were saying, oh, don't worry about this. It's not going to be bad. At worst, it's going to be like camping for a day or two. So we actually decided to evacuate after we went to several stores, because we thought maybe we would write it out, and then found out that everybody was sold out of all kind of basic necessities. And then we went back to my office and we were able to get online and just saw this humongous storm. You might have seen kind of those NOAA images, the black and white kind of swirling of the storm coming up onto the coast. And that's when we realized we've got to get out of there. And so we ended up evacuating. And then coming back in once the roads were finally open enough, and it was just blown away by the destruction and aftermath that I saw.
You know, when I moved to New York City, ultimately to start Let My People Go, within 2 weeks of moving to New York City, we were hit by Hurricane Sandy.
Hmm.
And it threw me because here I am in a 2-bedroom apartment with 7 people for 5 days. And if you want to experience community, go through a natural disaster together.
Uh-huh.
Like, we didn't know what to do. We didn't leave the house. It was kind of like Noah and his family on the ark. Like, we were just staying in there for like our safety. And then all of a sudden we left and we were weird. We were just like, let's go to McDonald's. Yeah, that'd be good. Like, we didn't know how to interact with the world for a little bit. Like, that was the very odd Halloween that year. But one thing that I've learned since Sandy is, and one thing I've learned growing up in Florida, where you have hurricanes consistently, is yes, these natural disasters can make you vulnerable, but sometimes you already have other vulnerabilities. For instance, my family, my mother, as you know, is bedridden, and she has some medical complications that have led to this. And when a hurricane comes, that's a big deal for us. And I know as Katrina came, you were also dealing with your own personal disasters that kind of made you vulnerable. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the things that Katrina really opened my eyes to was that the disaster itself, like you said, aren't the only things they don't just create vulnerability. They also reveal vulnerabilities that already exist in a community and even maybe amongst who we are. During that time, and as I was working with a lot of underserved communities, started to just really see about how going through a disaster creates what some would call a spiral of loss. That it's not just about trying to get back the resources you had before a disaster, but it actually takes even more energy, more money, more time to be able to kind of claw your way back up to even what you had, which is why I think the work that you do is so important. And then later on, after Katrina, so about 5 years later, I was actually diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and really saw the things that I've been studying for quite some time starting to play out in my own personal life.
Wow, because for me, like, hearing that kind of challenges me, because one of the things that Let My People Go does is we challenge the church to love vulnerable people through their own vulnerability. We believe that your own vulnerability is the thing that, in a sense, qualifies you to love other messy, broken people. And as you started experiencing this journey with cancer, how did that open your eyes to your neighbor?
I think one of the things that it really taught me was that we can either let our pain and our vulnerabilities and our suffering be walls to keep people out, or we can treat them like doors as ways that we can enter into the lives of others and let them enter into our own personal lives as well. And for me, that was really challenging because I spent my whole career as a helper. I'm the person that wants to deploy to the disaster zone to help others who are going through a problem. And it was really hard for me to let others take care of me during that time. But doing that also made me more aware just about, even as I was in that very dire situation and was struggling, and now very grateful to be in remission, just still realizing how many resources though that I had people that came along and walked alongside me. I had a job that still kept me employed during that time. But when we see natural disasters or other form of mass disasters happen, most people aren't that fortunate. It's like, for instance, I remember when Katrina hit, at first being worried about, am I going to get a paycheck? And realizing that I still got paid, even though I didn't teach for over a month. That I had a job, I've got a doctorate, and I had a good place of employment. But for the person working at, say, McDonald's or the Waffle House or some other place, that when their employer had to close shop, they no longer kept getting a paycheck. And that makes them very vulnerable, especially to trafficking situations. because now people are trying to find out, how do we make ends meet? How do we continue to survive in these situations when I don't have resources?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because we like to view things through a compartmentalized mindset, don't we? We're like, okay, so this is where we put the at-risk youth. This is where we view the homeless. This is how we handle disasters, but we can't see it as ultimately kind of a pantheon of vulnerability, and human trafficking being a catch-all injustice that preys upon all of it. When the earthquake happened in Nepal several years ago, we were hearing reports of trafficking organizations and individual traffickers who are masking themselves as relief workers, who are going and exploiting people in rural villages, people who were isolated, people who were impoverished. And so for us, what I think you and I are both saying is that as you care for those who are made vulnerable through, whether it be a personal or a natural or a social disaster or a technical disaster, you're ultimately impacting those who could, are, or have been trafficked. Would you agree?
Yeah, when I really kind of step back and I think about the work that we've done, if there's such thing as an X factor to resilience, I think it's that social support, that it's coming along and being able to provide a sense of community. Because a lot of individuals who are at the highest risk for being trafficked often really lack that kind of social support network, that there's nothing to really kind of protect them from falling prey to those that might want to cause harm. I was kind of reflecting there on your story about the traffickers who were pretending to be relief workers. Well, one of the first times that I first was exposed to finding out about trafficking and its connection to disasters, honestly, it was something I never actually was aware of until I started and our team started working in Haiti after the earthquake a few years ago. And one of the things that we became aware of was a cultural practice there called restavik, which in some cases is a form of child servitude, but oftentimes is a form of trafficking or child slavery. And after the earthquake, we were asked to go over and work with local church leaders to help them develop a trauma program for children that had been rescued out of trafficking situations, out of restavik, who had a lot of severe post-traumatic stress disorder issues that they were struggling with. And one of the things that we heard was how people would pose to different orphanages or even families where maybe they lost a spouse, or maybe a child lost both parents and we're now living with somebody else. And we're telling them, oh, we'll give them a better life. We'll take them to the city. We'll help them find a family that's going to love them. And in many cases, that turned into a trafficking situation. One of the stories that really sticks with me was learning of one of the children that we were helping who had been trafficked, and hearing her talk about how in the house that she was being held captive, that she felt that the dog was more human than what she was, that she did not get to eat until after the dog had ate the scraps that had fallen from the table. And then to hear her talking about how one of the ways she tried to protect herself was at night, when one of the men that lived there would often attack her, that she would take glass plates that she could find through the house and lay them around her under the table in hopes that he would step on them, and so that it would cut him or at least cause a noise so that she could try to wake up and have a hope of trying to escape. And we oftentimes, when we see natural disasters, we see things like the earthquake, we see the homes that are destroyed, but we don't often see the lives that are being destroyed by trafficking in these horrible situations.
Yeah, a lot of times when I hear someone's story, they'll say, this fill in the blank disaster happened when I was a kid, or my family went through this, or my dad lost a job, or what have you. I experienced this traumatic event. And then they kind of tell their story, and you can just see like that traumatic event, whether it was personal or it was something that their entire community faced, it impacted that person, and it kind of just really made this person susceptible to exploitation. Mm-hmm. And so for us, I mean, me as well, I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, okay, say another Hurricane Sandy comes to our community, or recently I was in Florida a week. I was in Key Largo a week before Irma hit. Everyone was panicking. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about this, but I'm also thinking, even though I've grown up in the eye of the storm, so to speak, and I think I know everything about hurricanes that there is to know, like Floridians, we pride ourselves on that, to the point that we start doing dumb things. But I'm very super confident in that. Every time a hurricane comes, I always doubt. I always start freaking out a little bit. And I'm always like, okay, have I done everything? What do I do? And so for the rest of us, could you help us understand what are some things that we can do to respond to a disaster?
Well, one of the things that I keep going back to that really resonates with me is your organization's emphasis on caring for the vulnerable. And what I would really hope that those who are listening in would consider is not just thinking about the response, but what can we do before the disaster hits? And like what you were saying, the more that we can address injustices in our communities, like extreme poverty, if we can start to help create jobs and an economy that keeps people employed that might not otherwise have resources, that if we can start to tackle gang presence in our community, that really loving our neighbor and loving them well before disaster, I really truly think is the best thing that we can do to help prepare. Because then when that disaster hits, your community and those who are at the greatest risk are going to have more resources and hopefully be more resilient because of the work that you've done beforehand. But afterwards, one of the things that I would encourage individuals to think about, because it can be really overwhelming. Our team actually deployed to Houston after Hurricane Harvey not long ago this year. And I met this local pastor, and his church, even though the inside of it had been pretty much gutted out by the flood, they had set out front and were serving meals and providing goods and necessities to people in their community. And as I was listening to him tell their story, it was really overwhelming to hear everything that they'd been through. And I asked him, so how did you even know where to start? What did you decide to do? And he said, well, it was overwhelming because we knew all of Houston was hit. So we decided we're going to own our neighborhood. So we're going to own this block right around here. And we're going to do everything we can to be an example of Christ and of hands and feet, of helping those that are in need. And that really had an impact on me. Just really thinking about that when it comes to a disaster, we can't do everything, but we can care for those who are right there in our backyards. And he was talking about how they decided to start giving out water because that was a resource they had. And then suddenly people that were coming in from out of town, somebody called and said, hey, we've got a barbecue, like portable barbecue maker. And if we can come, we can serve hundreds of people. And they start doing that. And then somebody hears about the barbecue. And then now people are dropping off goods to help clean their homes. And it just kept snowballing. So rather than thinking about having to start to do everything and starting big, start small. What's the one thing your church already does well? And then think about how it can pivot in times of a disaster.
One thing I love about what you just said is that you really focused on empowerment. And I feel like some of us, when a disaster hits, we immediately want to send bottles of water, we want to send canned food, and we do acts of charity. And that can be okay. But sometimes when you just do charity and you don't empower the people who are already on the ground, who are going to be there after you leave, you really end up leaving it worse than you found it. One person who went to Houston was telling me that they brought all these truckloads of water, so many bottles of water, and they got there and they went to a distribution site and they said, we brought water. And the person looked at them and said, okay, just take it to the back. And it cracked me up because they were like, there were so many bottles of water. It was a mountain of water. And I really wondered, were we helping them the way that we thought we were? And I love this idea of saying, here's a church, their sanctuary has been gutted, but we're coming alongside of them. Mm-hmm. We're asking them what they need. How can we help funnel and fuel their vision for their community? And I love that you do that. And I love that you see that vulnerability and you see how you can come alongside and say, we just want to lift you up. We want to help you in any way that you can be helped. And so I think that's a very challenging thought. And with that said, this is our time for Q&A. So if anyone has a question, please type it into the Q&A box and we will deal with that. We look forward to hearing your questions, but as we wait, I have a question. In this realm of vulnerability, how can we as the church do a better job of identifying vulnerable people when a disaster takes place?
I think the first place to start is to look for who are the most marginalized within your own community. And that may vary from community to community. So, I just shared, for instance, that our team was down in Houston after Harvey. And as we were working and listening to a lot of the local churches there, one of the things that we were hearing from them was that there were a number of immigrants, and especially undocumented immigrants there, that were more or less kind of going underground because they were nervous. You've got the federal government coming, knocking on doors, asking if they can help. And even though it was FEMA and first responders who really were trying to provide care, you can imagine some of the suspicion that they had and afraid of being identified and that they may actually be deported. And so in those communities, it was largely immigrant populations. But then if you think about other communities, it may be if you have a very strong or high level elderly population in your community, those may be the individuals that are most at risk. So always start by looking at who's marginalized in your community.
I think that's incredible, because that's where we start with the fight against human trafficking, because if you can identify those who are marginalized, and one thing we say is, if you want to find those who are victims of human trafficking, you're going to have to realize that they're hidden in plain sight, right behind your assumptions. It's the people that we label. Those are the people who are most at risk. And sometimes these people can be stigmatized. These people can be the girl who's considered promiscuous, or the mom who has been in and out of prison, or the dad who has anger issues. We sometimes are afraid to look beneath the surface. And here's the deal. If you're busy putting on a label to someone, chances are you don't have time to listen to their story and actually hear what's going on in their lives. And so you're going to miss the vulnerable people in front of you. And so I like that idea of saying, who is marginalized? Who is the person that could really suffer?
And I think you're totally right too, that oftentimes those who are being trafficked are right there in plain sight. We oftentimes think about those who are being trafficked in terms of sex trafficking, but around disasters, another major trafficking issue is labor trafficking. So for example, going back to Hurricane Katrina, there was a case there that the Poverty Law Center Southern Poverty Law Center investigated, and ended up finding that there were between 500 and 700 people from India who were promised good jobs in the US and were trafficked and actually held by armed gunmen at night to be able to stay and work for extremely cheap labor and held against their will. So here you actually have mainly men out there working, repairing homes, coming into people's homes, right, that need help, but they themselves were also victims.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just miss those people oftentimes. We just think, well, that person from that country, they need to pick oranges, or they need to work in restaurants because they're making more money here than they would back home. And so they're just sending it back home. And in all of these assumptions and all of these thoughts, we may be missing what's actually happening. Because almost everyone I've ever talked to who said that, I've asked, hey, have you met this person? Have you talked to them? Have you listened to their story? And almost every time it's a resounding no. So
yeah, that listening is so essential, because when we look at disaster relief, or if we're tackling trafficking, the effective response is always relational at its core. That just like the example you gave of the person who was sending all these water bottles to find out, well, we've already got water. I've seen situations where, in one case, where a church raised about $60,000 worth of frozen meals and sent them to a disaster zone. Well, there was a couple problems with that. There was no way to freeze that food once it got to the disaster zone. And there was no electricity either to be able to cook the food. So $60,000 of food went and spoiled on the side of the road. So if we really do want to help effectively, we need to ask those who are impacted about what their needs are and how we can best walk alongside them. I think sometimes we want to put on a Superman cape and fly in, when instead we need to remove that cape and humble ourselves in the way we respond.
One of my last questions for you, Jamie, comes from the article that you wrote for Christianity Today, where you talked about your own cancer journey. What do you think the biggest lesson that you've learned through that battle, what would that be?
I think the biggest lesson that I learned is that we often have less control than what we really think that we do. And that it's important that we learn to spiritually surrender the things that maybe are beyond our control, but at the same time, doing the best that we can with the resources God's provided us to tackle the challenges ahead.
Wow. So you're saying that we're not in control like we think we are. We think we have it all together. We think we're working things out. And you're telling me that I have to understand that I may not have it together and things may not work the way that I expect, and that's okay?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories that I had heard a few years ago from a colleague of mine was about a group of soldiers that had been practicing out in this mountain terrain, and they got horribly lost, and they thought at that point that their lives were over, and they found a map, and from that map they were able to find it back to base camp and survive this harsh winter that was happening. But it was once they got back, they realized that the map was the wrong terrain. It was a whole different map. It wasn't even about that mountainside. And I think sometimes we approach our lives in that same way, that if we've got a map, if we have a plan, everything's going to be okay. When in reality, I think what's more important than the plan is the people around the plan that we're working with, that we're engaging with, that we're struggling with, that we're walking alongside with, that makes the biggest difference.
Well, I think you and I would both be able to say that it was when our lives completely fell apart that we were brought to a point that we could actually recognize our calling, that we could see what God was challenging us to do. And I found it's generally in that place of fear and risk that I find this heavenly reward, this thing that I'm like, wow, I've never experienced anything as fulfilling as what I do. And it wouldn't have happened had I not suffered.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like your vulnerability and your suffering and your own brokenness is almost the key to finding that thing that God is calling you to do.
One of the things that also really stood out to me after my cancer experience was, just in our brief time together, I've used the word resilient a few times, and kind of a textbook definition there is taking a beach ball and pushing it underwater and it bounces back to the surface. The same thing with us when we're under stress, we bounce back to normal. But one of the things I realized when we go through some of these major events, we don't always bounce back, that it's sometimes more of a long suffering. And so I've actually been doing a lot more thinking and research on spiritual fortitude lately, that it's not just about getting over a disaster or a pain to get back to living, but it's learning to live in the pain, whereas the real growth happens.
Wow. Jamie, you've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
I know that I'm going to be thinking about this for the rest of the day. So thank you so much. And anyone else who tuned in today, know that we have these webinars every first Tuesday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so if you are a pastor or if you are just a member at a church who's passionate about these issues, please tune in and just walk with us. We have Q&A every time so that you can ask any question, but we want to really help you love your neighbor better and help you understand your vulnerability and how that is a key to helping others who are in vulnerable situations. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Aten.
And before you go, I just wanted to mention to others that on February 1st, we're going to be having a Pursuing Disaster Justice Forum at Wheaton College. Awesome. So I want to encourage people to go to our website at wheaton.edu/HDI to learn more about that. And trafficking will be one of the issues that we'll be tackling there.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to that. So thank you so much. And we will see you all next month.